Today on Don't Talk TV, we're going to take a look at the final report of the Public Order Emergency Commission that was released on Friday, the 17th of February, 2023. Hello, my name is Nicholas Wansbutter. I'm a lawyer in Stratford, Ontario, Canada, and welcome to Don't Talk TV. So as I said in the preamble, the Public Order Emergency Commission that was to look into whether the invocation of the Emergencies Act last February was justified released its final report this past Friday, the 17th of February 2023. As viewers have no doubt seen in media reports, because the media was given the final report before council were, interestingly enough, the commissioner found that the invocation of the act was justified and that some trucks honking horns in Ottawa, this presented a national emergency that required the invocation of these extraordinary powers. We saw what sorts of powers were used. Conscription. I call it conscription when you force people to work for the government. Doesn't need to be fighting as a soldier in a war. They conscripted tow truck drivers, or they at least could have, to force them to tow vehicles out of there. We saw bank accounts frozen. We saw every war monument in the whole country being declared a no-go zone, where citizens could, in theory, be arrested if they even approached one of these sites in order to pay their respects. So some very extreme and unprecedented powers taken by our government. Now, the report itself is thousands of pages long. Full disclosure, I don't have time to read all that. Just the executive summary is almost 300 pages long. So I'm just going to look at a few highlights from the executive summary. The links to that summary and all of the other documents will be in the show description if you have time and want to read through the documents in detail to see how the commissioner reached his ultimate decision. And then I'll give a few of my thoughts on this as we go and at the end. So as a starting point, I just want to show viewers where you can find these documents. You go to publicorderemergencycommission.ca/final-report. Again, link in the show description, and that gives you, we've got the report here. So we've got Volume 1, that's the summary, and then we've got Volume 2, Analysis Part 1, Volume 3, Analysis Part 2 and Recommendations, Volume 4, Process and Appendices, and Volume 5, various policy papers. So we've got more documents than you can shake a stick at here. We're going to focus in on Volume 1 here. So I have open here Volume 1, the report of the public inquiry into the 2022 public order emergency. So again, I'm just going to skim some of the highlights that jumped out at me here because it is a 273-page document. So I've jumped to page 184 of the document, but in the PDF file it's page 185. I found this section interesting here, and it won't let me highlight the document for some reason, but this paragraph here where he says, I acknowledge that the Commission's role is distinct from that of a court. The Commission does not have the legal authority to adjudicate the lawfulness of the declaration as such. I do not intend or consider my findings on this topic to be in any sense binding on the courts. The effect or significance of the Commission's findings and conclusions in the judicial review proceedings will be a matter for the federal court to determine. So this doesn't necessarily end things. The courts have the final power of arbitration over whether this was lawful, and one might hope that they will have a different view of things, but let's look a little bit more. Page 187 of the PDF, 186 of the document has some interesting discussion, and this is something I see in criminal law all the time. This talk about the tension between speed and deliberation, and it says, in normal times, we expect government action to be timely and effective, but also cautious, deliberative, and well thought out. Acting in haste is generally considered the greater risk. Thus, the legislative process is designed to slow down government action, but the urgent character of emergencies, however, demands quick decisions, which cannot be achieved through the normal legislative process. So this is a theme over the next couple of pages of essentially giving the government the benefit of a doubt or giving them a lighter treatment or a lesser threshold because it's almost assumed from the start that this is an emergency situation. As I say, you see this a lot in criminal court where they say, well, dynamic situations, the police don't have the time for judicial reflection, so therefore it's okay if they trample people's rights because they have to act quickly. Now, I mean, I state it very generically and broadly. Some people might disagree with my characterization, but that's how I see it. I see it as watering it down too much. I certainly agree that one can't, sometimes it's an emergent situation, you have to act quickly, but wrong decision, still wrong decision, even looking at it from a distance. I think that's the difference between what the remedy ought to be versus whether it was done incorrectly to begin with. Now, there's a quote at the top of page 190 of the PDF, 189 of the document, that I find quite exceptional, where the commissioner says, "Put simply, the operational principle underlying the Emergencies Act is a recognition that in a situation of emergency it may be necessary for the executive to, quote, act now and ask later, unquote. Invocation of the Emergencies Act is a drastic move, but it is not a dictatorial one." Now, I find that very exceptional because I don't know what the definition of dictatorial is other than the things we see in the Emergencies Act: freezing bank accounts, conscripting people, prohibiting people from going places, the ability to seize property and use it as the government deems fit. I'm troubled by this because language has been changing a lot in recent years, and it seems like we're not being honest about what the Emergencies Act is. The Emergencies Act does give dictatorial powers because in an emergency situation you need a dictator. The ancient Romans knew this. That's where the term dictator comes from. In an emergency situation, they would appoint a dictator with temporary powers to take care of the situation. That is what the Emergencies Act is, in my view. So I don't like this manipulation of language or trying to claim it's something it isn't. And this failure to be honest about what we're talking about, I suspect, played a role in how we get to saying this was justified, because it's not dictatorial. You're going to hold someone to a lower standard if it's not dictatorial powers. I think we need to be clear, this is dictatorial powers, and that's why it's a very high threshold and should be a very high standard that the government is held to because of the sorts of powers that they have when this act is invoked. Now, starting around page 200 of the PDF, or 199 of the document, we start to see we start to see the facts that the commissioner accepted as true that led to his decision. So starting at section 28.2, he's assessing whether this was an urgent and critical situation. He's satisfied that a compelling and credible factual basis existed that objectively supported a reasonable belief that the lives, health, and safety of Canadians were seriously endangered. He says that the cabinet had 4 bases upon which they could believe this: dangers to the life, health, and safety of residents and other innocent bystanders in Ottawa, as well as other areas affected by protest; serious risk and injury to violence of the protests themselves. So he talks about the impact of the occupation on the residents of Ottawa, says that this was striking. They experienced negative effects on their physical and psychological health. Street obstructions impeded access to emergency services. They say there were danger to bystanders who found themselves in the midst of protests across the country. Says there were reasonable concerns regarding serious injury and violence arising from the protests themselves. A lot of emphasis seems to have been placed on the evidence of the OPS Deputy Chief Steve Bell, who claimed that on the 11th, 12th, and 13th, he remembers that weekend having extreme concerns for the safety of police, for the safety of the community, based on the volatile and escalation and violence in direct confrontational interactions. Interestingly enough, that was the weekend that I was at the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa. I didn't see any evidence whatsoever of what Officer Bell is describing there. Some half decent overtime, but lots of Peel Regional Police around here. I haven't seen much Ottawa police. Maybe they're all sleeping after being up for 2 weeks. So we got some violent racists going on here, so you can see. Alright, excuse me, so I'm going to sneak past you there. So you can see we're just getting into it now, but I mean, there's a party atmosphere here. Oh, sorry, excuse me. This isn't a dangerous insurrection by any means. This isn't.
This is what trench warfare looks like right now because our grandfathers died in war. And
Yeah,
this is
that's
how we
right.
as Canadians unite and stuff. I'm learning French now from Alberta.
Absolutely. Random happy people. What can I say? I mean, as I said in my brief YouTube appearance earlier today, I mean, the Emergency Management and Protection Act says that it has to be of major proportions with danger to physical harm of Canadians to declare an emergency. I'm not seeing anything that would support that definition here. And we've been walking around for a few hours earlier today. Describing there. It seems that the commissioner essentially just took the word of some Ottawa residents who came and said about how awful it was, and just took the word for this particular police officer. And I mean, I don't know exactly what evidence from the other side was presented, but it seems that this is the direction that he's coming at, that all the media propaganda, and I call it propaganda because in my view it totally contradicted the reality on the ground, all this propaganda that this was a violent protest. I mean, I didn't see anyone being even remotely disrespectful to police, and I think there's a reason that they had to bring in police who had never been in Ottawa before the invocation of the Emergencies Act in order to put it down, because the officers who were on the ground interacting with the peaceful and frankly even cheerful for the most part protesters on the ground, they would have had a hard time beating those people up, arresting them, throwing them in jail, because they saw what this was really all about, whereas they could fill other officers' minds full of views of these evil anarchists who are destroying our society and they need to be put down, and then get those officers to be all on board to load up with the SWAT gear or load up with the anti-riot gear and go, kick some butt and chew bubblegum, but maybe not having enough bubblegum on hand. So his final conclusion, he quotes the minister who introduced the Emergencies Act, who said, "When the country is threatened by serious and dangerous situations, the decision whether to invoke emergency powers is necessarily a judgment call, and it depends not only on the assessment of current facts, but even more on judgments about the direction events are in danger of moving." So government's allowed to look into the crystal ball here. So he says, "For these reasons, I've concluded Cabinet was reasonably concerned that the situation it was facing was worsening and at a risk of becoming dangerous and unmanageable. There is credible and compelling evidence supporting both a subjective and objective reasonable belief in the existence of a public order emergency." Now, we can talk all day about what was actually going on in Ottawa and other places. I mean, the border blockade in Coutts and Windsor didn't even exist anymore, as far as I can recall. Certainly Windsor had been already shut down by the time the Emergencies Act was invoked. All I ever saw were peaceful protesting, and that's the real concern here, is this distortion of reality, or this view of reality that's at odds with the reality I saw on the ground, and many, many other people have seen on the ground. I mean, mainstream media weren't on the ground. They just went off of certain reports. The bottom line is, in my view, this was a crackdown on political dissidents. People disagreed, they dared to disagree with the Liberal Party of Canada, and had to be crushed. That was what was getting out of control. Now, I'm sure that many viewers are very upset by this. I'm very concerned about the precedent this sets, because if it's a national emergency worthy of the Emergencies Act, of a protest with some trucks, and really not even that many people, in my view, there were a few thousand, there weren't tens of thousands. If that's worthy of the Emergencies Act, then that opens the floodgates for all kinds of things, and as I've opined before, I think it opens the door to climate emergencies, declarations of climate emergency, and we've looked at some of the powers that are available in the Emergencies Act, including seizure of property, not allowing people to go places. I fear that this opens the door for eventually seizing people's property if it's deemed you have too big of a house, or you live in the country, we want to make you live in a 15-minute neighborhood, which we'll talk about next week. Climate emergency, we're taking your property, you need to go live in the 15-minute neighborhood. I mean, that's just the tip of the iceberg of things that are possible. It's very disturbing to me. And it's also very troubling when you compare it and contrast it to things that aren't an emergency. If people are protesting in favor of the current thing, even if they're ripping down statues and doing damage to property, which never happened in Ottawa at the Freedom Convoy, that's not an emergency because they have the quote-unquote right political position. Let me just leave with a final thought for people who are tempted to anger by this, tempted to thoughts of vengeance. I came across this prayer at Mass this past Sunday, and it's one that I'm trying to guide myself with when things like this happen, or when we're confronted by people doing things that we feel are very detrimental to ourselves. And the prayer reads as follows, quote, "The vengeance which I desire for my enemies is that thou wouldst visit them with thy graces." I think that's the vengeance, the only type of vengeance we should be seeking, is praying that the people who did this and are doing these things, that they'll be visited with God's graces and they'll convert. So this video is not legal advice. If you need legal advice, call a lawyer. You can call myself or another lawyer. My phone number and website are listed below. If you have any suggestions of a topic you'd like to see me cover on this channel, please send an email to the email address listed below or leave a comment in the comment section. And if you found this video at all interesting, helpful, or informative, please consider liking, sharing, subscribing, and following us on social media.